thank you so much for inviting me on to speak. And I've been asked to try and give a rough introduction on just honour-based abuse. So apologies for anyone who's on the call who's quite well versed, but my input is really about trying to make people understand the basics of honour-based abuse. Just to kind of, like I said, introduce myself, my name's Mariam. I am the Chief Executive of an organisation called AMINA, and we do a lot of campaign work specifically around honour-based abuse and highlighting this kind of abuse, which in my opinion is very prevalent within certain communities. So we will have a wee look. I'm going to just share some of my slideshows here as well. Hopefully that does come up and you can see that there. And we can just kind of maybe, I suppose, talk about honour-based abuse and I suppose the drivers for honour-based abuse. So I'm just double checking here right now, bear with me. So just to talk about honour-based abuse and what is honour-based abuse. So honour-based abuse includes certain factors, physical abuse, it can be harmful behaviours such as emotional abuse, forced marriages, and killings, which are commonly known as honour killings. Now, these acts are there and done to protect or restore the family's honour, and there are certain social groups and communities that often support and encourage honour-based abuse. And often what you'll find is that they are using informal structures to enforce these harmful practices. Let's go on to the next slide. So what is honour-based abuse and how does it impact women? Now, in some cultures, women and girls are seen as the carriers of honour, which is considered extremely valuable. And I mean, really just thinking about that patriarchal structure that's there, that, you know, if there is anything good in us, if there's anything honourable, that would only come from a woman carrying that certain honour. And really, and I will talk about other kind of things that are kind of going on globally right now as well, just to kind of make you understand a bit more about how honour and how that kind of level of honour is put on women. Now, honour will serve three purposes. So the social status, if you have the good, decent, honourable women, it gives you a higher position in society. So for many families, you know, you can be, you know, your boys could be into drugs, they could be gang-related violence, etc. Whatever they do, it doesn't matter. If you have good, honourable, educated, and I suppose well-behaved women, you know, it will give you that higher position in society. Also creates a social division, so it helps keep certain social groups like clans and castes separate. A lot of people that are born in BME communities, specifically South Asian communities, certainly do have a caste system within that I think some people still actually do follow. So again, it's that honourable thing about, you know, she's married within her caste. I mean, it's obviously an economic value as well. It's treated almost like money, influencing how families are viewed in the community. So this is what's placed on women when it comes to honour and how it affects them. So there's a lot of, I would say, stress for a lot of women because this is what they're expected to, I suppose, uphold. And what does this honour system usually look like? It is unwritten rules to protect the honour, but honour is often seen as a male responsibility. But it is enforced through the control of a woman's behaviour, okay? So it's a male responsibility to make sure that he's upholding the honour within that family, but the only way he's going to do that is by controlling the woman's behaviour. This system's often supported by clans, large family networks, or castes, social groups based on status. Now, there are certain castes that class themselves almost as royal castes, you know, and there's certain castes that are seen as lower social status castes also, but the caste system I think is also quite important in the honour systems. But also you've got communities and kinship groups and extended families, especially in close-knit social groups as well, will help, I suppose, carry on this honour system that we see. Now, there's often many common drivers for honour-based abuse. We see many women who are seeking a divorce, even if the husband is abusive, or wanting to leave an abusive relationship. That can cause a lot of dishonor within the family, a lot of shame within certain in-laws, and certain communities. Now, Amina, we had actually done an event just recently on honour-based abuse, and it had Fawzia Jawaid's case kind of spoken about. And if those of you have not seen the Push documentary, I mean, it's something that her mum speaks about a lot, that her daughter was killed, but far as she's concerned, her daughter was killed, and one of the drivers for that was honour-based abuse. So it was about her bringing shame to the in-laws and then restoring that honour by killing her. So she largely believes, although her husband was convicted of murdering her, honour-based abuse was a big part to play in what she feels like is the reason why her daughter was killed, committing alleged adultery. So a lot of women won't commit adultery, but yet this is what is being alleged. Having a boyfriend or girlfriend, being a victim of sexual abuse. Again, that can be dishonourable because, you know, you're not that pure virgin anymore. Marrying out with your ethnicity, caste or religion. That's often quite an important issue for many close-knit communities. And expressing a desire for a same-sex relationship, I would say, is a big driver for honour-based abuse. It's still seen as quite a shameful thing in many communities to come out and to say that, you know, you maybe are being identifying that you are wanting to be in a same-sex relationship. And certainly the cases that we have supported, we have seen many women flee abuse and honour-based abuse because they have identified as being lesbians. And wanting to go out on her own, something that's really, really simple. You know, Shafilia Ahmed's case that we'd seen was that, you know, she was seen as being too westernized and not conforming to what is seen being acceptable within communities. Actions that are often taken to maintain the honour, well, forced imprisonment into the family home, forced marriage, which is something that we see a lot, emotional blackmail, and unfortunately honour killings such as murder, physical violence including food, sleep deprivation, ostracising them socially, and rape also. And I mean, rape is one of those things that you would see there and you think, well, where does that belong? One of the cases that we have is Banaz Mahmood's case. When her body was found and her post-mortem was done, it showed that she had been raped as well before she was murdered. And that is something, I suppose, to say to many women that, well, you're a dishonourable woman. You don't deserve that honour. You're not a pure woman. So this is what's going to happen to you. Again, if we're looking at honour-based abuse and you think to yourself, well, why does this happen? Well, if you're looking in the UK in general, where are we seeing a lot of this honour-based abuse happen? Well, what you will see predominantly is a lot of South Asian communities. And by South Asian, I mean Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi. A lot of Kurdish communities and Turkish communities. What we also find is that to avoid any legal consequences, and this is quite important, that some families do send women to other countries like Pakistan for forced marriages or killings. And that's something that we've seen in the Samia Shaheed case here. Samia was lured to Pakistan by saying that one of her family members were not well. I think it was her dad or her gran, and she'd gone over to Pakistan. And again, Samia had got divorced. And she had left her husband and remarried. 6 days after travelling to Pakistan, she was found dead. Her then husband noticed that something was wrong when she stopped texting him before she was due to return home. But with the stories that we've uncovered in AMINA, certainly we're seeing quite a lot of stories like this where a lot of women have gone missing over the years, and it's really difficult to tell how many women have actually gone missing over the years. I'm just going to kind of stop sharing there as well. It's really difficult to tell how many women in the UK and Scotland have gone missing over the years. We've came across a lot of cases where women have gone abroad and she's died of a sudden car accident, or, you know, it's been told that she had an asthma attack. And that's not something that always seems quite believable when you know that she was also a victim of honour-based abuse. Looking at honour-based abuse, you're kind of asking to yourself, it does happen in certain cultural expectations. Now, what I would say is that looking at culture and where honour-based abuse happens, it's really nothing to do with a particular culture. Okay. And I think to try and define it as being a cultural expectation is wrong. Honour-based abuse, and the best way to understand it, it's another universal patriarchal structure that oppresses women worldwide. Okay, so it's a universal patriarchal structure and it's there to oppress women and control women. There's another rhetoric out there with honour-based abuse. Now, we had kind of done this event and it was on STV yesterday, and again we were speaking about honour-based abuse. And some of the comments online were really interesting because a lot of people were saying, oh, well, these Muslims, they do this and this is what Muslims do. And, we need to get rid of this religion and then we'll get rid of honour-based abuse. That's kind of really what some of the comments were saying. And, it kind of just reminded me of that typical rhetoric and I suppose misconception that's out there. First of all, we're not a homogenized group that follow an Islamic culture, and there are 1.5 billion Muslims, and it's not a fixed culture. It's not even a religious practice. Again, it's rooted in patriarchy. And one thing that we find is in many patriarchal structures and religious structures, it is suited for many men to say, well, this is religious when it's clearly not. So it's a kind of bit of an understanding of where honour-based abuse is, that there is no culture that actually does promote that. But again, these are patriarchal structures that will exist. I would still say that honour-based abuse isn't quite known and isn't largely understood as much, but yet there are still many honour-based abuses and killings that happen within Scotland. So again, that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of understanding honour-based abuse, why it happens, how it happens, and how it impacts women. Again, if there's any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you.
Thanks. So hi, everyone. I'm Julia, and I, as Samantha said, work in the Violence Against Women and Girls team at the Scottish Government. So today, I just want to give a bit of an overview of our work to address violence against minority ethnic women and girls over the past year, including our work to address honour-based abuse. So as a starting point, and to give a bit more context, last year we refreshed the Equally Safe strategy, which is the Scottish Government and COSLA's joint strategy to prevent and eradicate violence against women and girls. There are a number of different reasons for updating that strategy. Firstly, we wanted to make sure that the strategy was clear and understandable to those who are working across different areas, from justice to health, to education and housing. This just really reflects our recognition that violence against women and girls is a cross-sectoral issue, and it requires coordinated action in order for us to see real and sustainable change. Another key driver for the strategy refresh was the social and legislative changes that we've seen take place over the past few years. So since the last strategy was published, for example, new technology and the emergence of online platforms has led to the development of different forms of violence against women. And also, given that Scotland is so culturally rich and diverse, we also knew that we needed to consider the needs of women from a range of different backgrounds. So despite acknowledging all of those changes, our definition of violence against women and girls continues to fundamentally recognise that it's a cause and consequence of gender inequality. During the refresh process, we built on this understanding to really try and expand that definition of violence against women and girls to include a really broad range of harmful behaviours and experiences that might take place in the private, public, physical or digital spheres. Again, that just really reflects our commitment to ensure Equally Safe is kept up to date and that we're able to respond to the evolving nature of gender-based violence. Our more comprehensive definition includes honour-based, economic and digital abuse, which will really help us to just address that full spectrum of violence against women and girls more effectively. And building on that last slide, we also want people working across different sectors to be aware of the different forms of violence that exist so we can improve our response to it. So during that refresh process, we had really clear concerns from stakeholders about minority ethnic women's experiences of abuse. We therefore included statistics and quotes that are on that slide within the strategy to try and improve understanding of the frequency at which minority ethnic women and girls experience violence and some of the specific barriers that they face. This information demonstrates that Black and minority ethnic women and girls can face more barriers to support and services than the general population, including language barriers, immigration status, institutional racism, and cultural insensitivity. It really illustrates, I think, the seriousness of the issue, and it hopefully begins to show how complex the challenges that we need to overcome are. So in recognition of those issues, a few years ago, we established a network to consider and inform the Scottish Government's approach to violence against minority ethnic women and girls, comprising of members from the third, statutory and academic sectors. It provides advice to support and manage the delivery of actions to prevent violence against minority ethnic women and girls, but also to support victims and survivors. During engagement with the network, we've heard from specialist support organisations about the need for accessible communications to ensure that minority ethnic women are aware of their rights. We've also heard about the need for consistent geographical service availability and accessibility for support for minority ethnic women throughout Scotland. And the network's also really emphasised the need for professionals working across different sectors to be trained on the prevalence and forms of violence that minority ethnic women can experience. This has really highlighted that better cultural awareness across services could not only improve the confidence of professionals, but also the trust of survivors. In addition to consulting with our network to inform our work, we also looked at research and evidence on the experiences of minority ethnic women and girls. There are a number of pieces of research that we've looked at, but today I'll provide a brief overview on a Scottish Government evidence review that was led by our Justice Analytical Services. So the purpose of that review was to really widen our understanding of minority ethnic women's experiences of domestic abuse and to explore the barriers to reporting, which we know are a really real issue. The evidence from that review suggests that some minority ethnic women can experience distinct forms of abuse, including honour-based abuse and extended family abuse, which aren't widely recognised in mainstream understandings of domestic abuse and that aren't addressed by current policy or legislation. The reason this is problematic is because abuse can be misunderstood or overlooked by the police and other support services, and ultimately it can also prevent women from seeking and accessing support. So whilst we don't currently have a policy definition of honour-based abuse, from our research and evidence, we know that there is some consensus on the key features of honour-based abuse. That is that abuse is perpetrated to uphold the perceived honour of an individual, family, or a community, and that it often involves multiple perpetrators, including women. We also know that there are a range of challenges in accessing support, and they can include fear of shame or reprisal for disclosing abuse, experiences of racism, and the way in which language around sexual abuse can be embedded in concepts of honour and shame that can make it difficult for women to talk about their experiences. The literature also tells us that in some extended family households, the daughter-in-law may hold the least power and can experience abuse from her partner and family members. As well as physical abuse, women may be subject to a range of controlling and harmful behaviours, including close surveillance of day-to-day activities, excessive domestic labour, social isolation, and economic abuse. Living in those abusive households can make seeking help or reporting abuse really difficult, and that's because women are often completely dependent on their husband and family for money and housing, and because they're constantly watched. So one of the last themes I'll just briefly touch upon that we came across was immigration, which is also closely linked to honour-based abuse and extended family abuse. Evidence suggests that migrant women are particularly vulnerable to abuse because of the immigration itself and how it works and how it's then exploited by perpetrators. The research also suggests that this environment provides those conditions for abuse to grow and, again, leaves women feeling they don't have a choice but to stay. And again, some of the other barriers include a poor grasp of English and that constant surveillance, which means that women might not be aware of their rights or just not in a position to report it. As well as engaging with our national stakeholders and the research to inform our work, we have also been engaging with international stakeholders with regards to our human rights obligations. So some of you might already be aware, but the UK ratified the Istanbul Convention on Preventing Violence Against Women last year. Our work in relation to the convention is currently being assessed by a group of experts that's appointed by the Council of Europe, who next year are going to provide a report with some recommendations on how we can improve our work. So just to give you an idea of what that might look like, we know that the UK is being praised for its ambitious approach to tackling violence against women and girls, but we've heard and we're really aware that there's still a really clear gap between policy and practice. We've heard that the UK needs to enhance its understanding of intersectionality, accessibility, and cultural sensitivity with regards to both policy making and service provision, and that applies to services in every sector. On top of this, we know that we need to improve our data and evidence so that we can get a better understanding of the prevalence of violence against women and girls and the key issues for minorities. And lastly, in the justice sector specifically, we know that our legal reform in relation to violence against women has been praised as innovative, but access to justice remains a concern, as well as the need for us to get a better understanding of who can and can't access the criminal justice system. We know that minority ethnic women can face specific barriers when it comes to accessing justice, so this is all really relevant in this context. So in order to address these concerns amongst various others, this year we worked with our stakeholders to identify the key actions we need to take to realise our aims in the refreshed Equally Safe strategy. So those aims are to stop violence against women and girls from occurring in the first place, to build the capability and capacity of support services, and to strengthen the justice response to victims and perpetrators. So that delivery plan contains 14 deliverables and actions related to those deliverables, and it covers the period from summer 2024 to spring 2026. Those actions aren't just led by the Scottish Government and COSLA, however, they're led by a range of partners across the public and third sector, including Public Health Scotland, Police Scotland, the Crown Office, local authorities, and many of our specialist support organisations. Again, that reflects that we really want to work together across the system to tackle these issues. So although our work to address violence against minority ethnic women and girls is our main focus today, I did want to give a brief overview of some of the other action areas in the delivery plan. This is because we're taking an intersectional approach to all of our work and will therefore be considering the needs of all women and girls in the delivery of all of the actions in the plan. So the delivery plan continues to place emphasis on prevention. It includes actions to embed a public health approach to preventing VAWG across organisations. It includes actions to improve data collection practices, actions to strengthen prevention work within the education sector, and actions to raise awareness of violence against women and girls more broadly. Recognising that we do need to strengthen our understanding of the diverse identities and experiences of women and girls in relation to VAWG, the plan also contains actions to address violence against minority ethnic women and girls with learning disabilities who've experienced abuse. In order to support survivors, our delivery plan also contains actions to promote workplace knowledge on violence against women and girls, and to improve our response to technology-facilitated VAWG. And lastly, the plan recognises, again, that need to work collaboratively and has some specific actions across health, public protection, housing and justice. So as I'd outlined earlier, we heard from stakeholders and from research that certain forms of violence against women and girls are insufficiently studied and reported on. We therefore wanted to develop clear actions that not only acknowledge some of those forms of abuse, but really commit us to addressing them. So the first action related to addressing violence against minority ethnic women and girls relates to the implementation of the FGM Protection and Guidance Act. That will strengthen the existing legislative framework for FGM and provide extra protection to women and girls who are at risk of FGM. We've also developed actions to address honour-based abuse and extended family abuse for the reasons that have been outlined already today. We intentionally did leave the wording ambiguous, that we want to develop a Scottish approach because we really want to work with our stakeholders, our specialist organisations, our researchers to determine what exactly that should look like. And lastly, reflecting on some of the challenges around immigration. Although asylum and immigration policy is reserved to the UK, we have developed an action to try and consider some of the possible solutions to address those challenges so that we can keep all women and girls safe from harm. So shortly after the publication of our delivery plan, we launched refreshed statutory guidance on forced marriage. We know from our specialist organisations and from research that forced marriage disproportionately impacts minority ethnic women and girls. We also know that victims of forced marriage may experience abuse from their partner and in some cases, family members. We know that to conform to expectations can create really real barriers to seeking support. The refreshed statutory guidance outlines the duties of statutory, public and third sector bodies in responding to forced marriages and offers procedures to prevent it from occurring, to protect those who are at risk and to help bring perpetrators to justice. To support the launch of that guidance, we also developed awareness-raising resources, including posters and fact sheets, including warning signs and the law in Scotland, and these were translated into a number of different languages and formats. We also developed fact sheets for professionals that provide advice on how to identify and handle cases of forced marriage effectively. All of those materials are available online on the gov.scot website and available for any organisation to use. So during a launch event to mark the publication of the forced marriage statutory guidance, we held a workshop to begin our work in the plan to address violence against minority ethnic women and girls. We invited a range of stakeholders, including our network and representatives from mainstream services, including Social Work Scotland, Police Scotland and local authorities. During the workshop, we heard from speakers presenting on forced marriage, honour-based abuse and extended family abuse, and we then asked our attendees 3 discussion questions to help us get a better understanding of honour-based abuse. So as I'd mentioned earlier, we don't currently have an agreed policy definition of honour-based abuse in Scotland. Because of that, developing one is the first step we are taking, and the workshop was really designed to help us do that. So it's clear that honour-based abuse is really complex. So agreeing a policy definition will help us by providing a consistent understanding of it across different areas, which will ultimately lead to better interventions and prevention efforts and make our response more effective. Agreeing a policy definition might also help victims and survivors to recognise abuse and really challenge the norms that foster it, which what we want to achieve is victims seeking help and breaking that cycle of abuse. So that's really important. And lastly, agreeing a policy definition of honour-based abuse will help distinguish honour-based abuse from some of the other forms of abuse that might share links but won't be identical. It will also support data collection and research, which will help us to identify the prevalence and impact of honour-based abuse and inform future policy and practice. So I'm just going to run very quickly through some of the findings in that workshop to give you an idea of where we are at the moment. So the first question that we asked during our workshop to help us to identify some broad areas of agreement about the nature of honour-based abuse. So all of the discussion groups recognise the driving role of perceived shame or dishonour in cases of honour-based abuse. Building on that, the nature of the socially constructed or perceived codes of honour was also discussed. The efforts by some perpetrators to misuse faith to justify their behaviours was given as an example, but it was also emphasised that honour-based abuse isn't condoned by any religious texts. All of the groups recognised honour-based abuse as a pattern of controlling behaviour, with that controlling behaviour triggering punishment for not abiding by rules. And they also recognised that it's fundamentally linked to patriarchal expectations and norms, with, as Mariam had said, women being seen as an extension of men's honour. So unsurprisingly, given the evidence we have, those who worked in mainstream services also acknowledged that honour-based abuse was hard to identify, with more engagement between services and specialist organisations needed to increase understanding. The second question that we asked related to who typically perpetrates honour-based abuse and what motivates it. So when discussing who typically perpetrates honour-based abuse, there was agreement that perpetrators could include partners, family members, and members of the community. But there was also agreement that there are a number of really complex layers of harm and abuse that we need to unpick further. With regards to motivations behind honour-based abuse, those patriarchal norms were highlighted again, with links drawn between different forms of honour-based abuse to underlying expectations and the need for perpetrators to uphold power by controlling women. The role of the community in cases of honour-based abuse was also considered. All of the groups noted the pressures and expectations in communities to remain silent, which made it more difficult to challenge abuse. And that also led to the discussion around the control of behaviour through gossip that can really isolate victims due to fear of reports back to their family. In addition to that discussion around the role of the community in cases of honour-based abuse, however, it is worth noting that the individual responsibility was also emphasised. So the final question that we asked was around the challenges in defining honour-based abuse. We heard that any definition would need to be broad enough to capture a different range of experiences, but narrow enough to capture specific issues and be meaningful. This reflected the acknowledgement that a range of individuals and groups can experience honour-based abuse while still recognising that it disproportionately impacts minority ethnic women and girls. We also heard about challenges around the framing of honour-based abuse as a cultural issue, which Mariam had touched upon, which can lead to negative stereotyping amongst both the services and the general public. Groups also pointed out that women often experience multiple forms of violence against women and girls in their lives, and that we can't view honour-based abuse in isolation. While some of the similarities between coercive control, honour-based abuse, and extended family abuse were clear, there are some distinctions that we still haven't been able to quite unpick. And lastly, the importance of language was also discussed, with agreement that consultation, particularly with those with lived experience, was really important to any definition. So in terms of our next steps, we'll first spend some time exploring the key issues and challenges that we began to uncover during that workshop. We want to get a better understanding of how honour-based abuse interacts with other forms of VAWG and how exactly the role of the community works with individual behaviours and decisions that lead to it. Alongside this, we'll also be reviewing the definitions of honour-based abuse that already exist. We'll be able to use those broad areas of agreement that we've identified and our understanding of the key issues to really determine whether any existing definitions actually already meet our needs and where there are key gaps. Once that work's complete, we'll work with our network and other key partners to draft a policy definition. And once everyone is happy with that, we'll be able to use it to develop effective interventions to address it. So aware that the summary I've given on our work was quite quick, but I hope that it's helped to provide an overview on what we're doing, why we're doing it, and yeah, everything that's fed into that process. We are just beginning this work and we've got a long way to go, but we're committed to working with our specialist organisations to develop an approach that works. So yeah, always welcome feedback, and we'll of course take questions at the end of the session. Thanks.
I am Dr. Elaine McLaughlin. This honour-based abuse research project was conducted between 2022 and 23. The title of the final paper is as displayed on the screen, Evidence and Pathways to Strengthen Protection for Victims. This was a collaborative project involving a multidisciplinary team of experts. The project was funded principally by the Scottish University's Insight Institute based at the University of Strathclyde, with small monetary donations from Hemat Gryffe Women's Aid and the University of Strathclyde Law School. Hemat Gryffe Women's Aid staff team also contributed resources in support of the project by providing translation services, writing skills and support for the women participating in the workshops. The team members are made up of academics from the world of law, psychology, social policy and social work. Myself and Vary have a wealth of experience as well as practical and working knowledge supporting women experiencing domestic abuse. I myself have been employed with Hemat Gryffe Women's Aid for 25 years and have supported thousands of women experiencing domestic abuse, forced marriage and honour-based abuse. I am now an operations manager responsible for governance and strategic matters affecting the charity. The funders of the honour-based research project approved creation of an animation of the findings at the conclusion of the project. By way of background, this research project was established in the back of PhD research that I have conducted. I attained a PhD in 2017 and the research area was focused on the impact of no recourse to public funds upon women from the South Asian community living in Scotland. It was a socio-legal study involving an examination of immigration rules and their negative impact on women experiencing domestic abuse. At the conclusion of the PhD research, notably a further area for consideration was honour-based abuse. There was significant evidence that women were experiencing abuse rooted in honour. It was apparent that women were experiencing abusive behaviours and mistreatment at the hands of not only their intimate partners, but also individuals from and within the extended family and community. The women described this as abuse as being linked to their family honour, family reputation, or is it? I was familiar with the practice of honour-based abuse as a form of abuse and its impact upon women as a consequence of my employment with Hemat Gryffe Women's Aid, and now we had empirical evidence and a description of what it was from women themselves. It is notable there is statutory legislation to protect victims of forced marriage and female genital mutilation, but no targeted legislation in Scotland to protect women experiencing honour-based abuse at the hands of multiple perpetrators. This is a unique and complex social problem worthy of further research. Ethical approval for this honour-based abuse research project was sought and obtained from the University of Strathclyde. A feminist methodology was adopted from the outset. There were online focus groups chaired by Professor Elizabeth Gilchrist using Zoom video technology. We knew the language of the women participating in the online events prior to the discussion starting, and I ensured interpreters were available where there was a language barrier. We also had experienced women's workers in hand to support women who may become upset during the sessions. A Scotland Loves Local voucher was issued to the women participating in the events and a Costa Coffee voucher for professionals. I would like to acknowledge at this point the incredible bravery of the women participating in the online discussions as they narrated their experiences and the gravity of their situations that they found themselves in and managed to flee. There were 3 online events using open-ended questions. The focus of this programme was to draw together an international multidisciplinary team of practitioners and experts in law, psychology, social work and social policy, government and the women's sector, along with women who have experienced honour-based abuse. The first online event involved a multidisciplinary team of international experts working in the field of domestic abuse and honour-based abuse. 33 individuals participated in Workshop 1. The questions asked during this session were: 1. How is honour-based abuse different to domestic abuse or intimate partner abuse? 2. Who are perpetrators and who are victims? 3. What strategies, policies or procedures have been successful in your jurisdiction relating to perpetrators of honour-based abuse and victims? Do you have an opinion as to why there has been success? 4. What advice would you offer Scottish policymakers to better address perpetrators of honour-based abuse and further assist victims? Events 2 and 3 were again facilitated by Professor Elizabeth Gilchrist and were well attended. In total, there were 15 women across both events. All the women participating were from a range of backgrounds, all had experience of domestic abuse and honour-based abuse. The questions raised in these focus groups were as follows. 1. What is family honour? 2. Are women abused if their behaviour is seen to betray family honour? 3. Who was being abusive towards you or someone you know in the name of honour? 4. What do the police and policymakers need to know to better protect victims of honour abuse? And 5. Any other comments or questions? In relation to the findings, there were similar understandings of what honour-based abuse was when comparing data from the international experts and the women who took part in the workshops. It is a practice that operates within family life and is ingrained in family members from a young age. Women are raised in an honour-based culture linked to socio-cultural traditions and practices operating within family and community life. It is a framework that punishes where women stray from what is considered as unacceptable behaviour. Honour-based abuse occurs where it is believed that an individual, normally a family member and in our experience women and girls, act in a manner which is considered shameful, which could damage the reputation of honour in the eyes of the family and wider community. Family honour influences intimate relationships and relationships with members of the family and wider community. Going on, it was clear from the data that women are raised within familial environments and communities where honour is a powerful concept. The family structures are patriarchal in nature, and women describe being prepared from an early age for what lay ahead for them in their life. One woman described these as life lessons. We've tried to capture this in the stories of the characters in the honour-based abuse animation. Women are ultimately subordinate to demands of male family members and, on occasion, female family members. There is an expectation for women to conform to customs and traditional cultural practices such as female genital mutilation and arranged marriage. There was evidence from the data that female family members within the extended family will be the perpetrators enforcing cultural traditions. There was strong opinion that a greater number of women and girls are more likely to be victims of honour-based abuse and family honour, which is a concept that is linked to the respect for one's parents, family and community. Considering the barriers for victims and survivors, as previously mentioned, there is no statutory definition of what honour-based abuse is currently in Scotland. This slide contains some of the problems that women described in the workshops. However, minority ethnic women encounter a range of difficulties constraining them in abusive circumstances. For example, language barriers, immigration barriers, particularly for women who have no recourse to public funds. There are women who are unaware that protection is available within Scots law and that they do in actual fact have legal rights. Migrant women are threatened with deportation as their legal rights in Scotland are misrepresented by their perpetrators. For example, they are told that the police will inform the Home Office and have them return to their country of origin, and some women have no financial means of escape. Significantly, it's important to consider abuse in a cultural context where women are constrained from seeking help when they're told by the family members that we don't go to the police for these matters. These are things that happen in our family and that protection is available within the family, as opposed to trying to get legal protection. Here the women encounter two competing factors, family protection versus police protection, whereby some of the women were forced to consider the need to protect the family as opposed to seek protection from the police and the criminal justice system for their own safety in the face of abusive behaviour. This situation caused difficulties for women who could not leave as they feared being ostracised, as being branded shameless for stepping outside the rules and boundaries of the family network and for betraying the family if they sought help. The women's rights, choices and freedoms were ignored by themselves in favour of protecting the reputation of the family and the community. In this context, women are competing with their cultural identity over their gender identity. On the one hand, women are required to show allegiance to the rules and obligations of their family and community, whilst being denied their own agency, individualism and freedom to make their own choices. And on the other hand, women are forced to ignore and reject access to legal protection and help and support from statutory and voluntary sector agencies in the face of honour-based abuse. It is when women rebel against the family rules that the concept of family honour appears, with family members demanding conformity, otherwise resulting in harm. In these circumstances, women who are harmed require to be protected because of the abuse that has occurred in the name of family honour. The specific circumstances that women will find themselves in will determine whether there is more than one perpetrator. There is at present a range of civil remedies available within Scottish jurisdiction for women experiencing domestic abuse. There are more refined legislative measures to protect women who experience female genital mutilation and forced marriage. There is, however, no explicit legislation enacted to protect women who encounter abuse with difficulties arising from family honour. Honour-based abuse is distinct from domestic abuse, as it can involve more than one protagonist, being other members of the family and the community. Family honour evolves inside a woman's family from birth, but also extends outside to the other family members and individuals in the wider community. Family honour requires respect from family members at a senior level in the family hierarchy and controls behaviour inside the family. Family honour is a unique concept and it can transgress the boundaries of a woman's immediate family to her extended family, community and wider family network locally, nationally and internationally. Family honour is a concept that allows for punishment of individuals who do not conform to the rules and socio-cultural and ancestral traditions of the family and wider network. Pretension to a breach of the Code of Honour might be brought by a family member inside the woman's immediate family, but can also be raised by a person outside their immediate family who, having a perceived legitimate interest in the reputation of the family network, might believe there to be behaviour straying from rules which appear damaging to the reputation and credibility of the entire network. It is therefore important that policymakers and legislators recognise the victims in honour-based abuse and implement law, policy and procedures that adequately address the needs of victims of honour-based abuse by showing a clear understanding of what honour-based abuse is. It is not perpetrated in a similar context to domestic abuse within current law, recognises perpetrators as the partners and ex-partners of the victims. The data identifies the need for a national consultation or strategy in relation to honour-based abuse. It is proposed that any national strategy recognise the significance of the cultural identity of women requiring allegiance to family honour and the difficulties that can arise for women who refuse to conform in order to provide the correct support and protection. From consideration of the data, I leave you with this explanation that, at a basic level, the primary victim of honour abuse is the woman who is abused. However, from the perspective of family and community members, it is they who are primary victim. To address this, a national framework should consider separate and distinct honour-based abuse legislation and policy, considering the intersectionality and multitude of factors affecting women from minority ethnic backgrounds, including abuse at the hands of intimate partners and family and multiple perpetrators, which I have identified as out with the scope of current Scottish domestic abuse legislation. Thank you for allowing me to present at this session today. I have included information in relation to the research paper and a link to the animation. I was the principal researcher and investigator in this research project, and my details are displayed in the slide. I am happy to be contacted in relation to my expertise in this subject matter and to answer any further questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samantha, for that introduction. So I'm Dr. Elizabeth Inyang, and this presentation is going to be on findings from my doctoral research, which concluded earlier this year at the University of Glasgow. Next slide, please. So FGM is a complex issue. It involves culture, health, rights. Next slide, please. In Scotland and in the UK at large, it involves a culture clash. Questions of double standards are raised because FGMC is illegal, but female genital cosmetic surgery, which is anatomically very similar, is allowed under the law for reasons of mental health, but not allowed for reasons of culture. So this raises questions of double standards. The question of scale, we don't know at what scale it's practiced. We do know that social pressure to have it performed in families does continue to exist, but that the figures we do have are unreliable to give us a clear sense of what's going on. Attitudes towards the practice are often described as entrenched, but there is a good evidence to show that in a diasporic context, people do reevaluate their position and change their attitudes to the practice. Next slide, please. So we have law, we have policy, we have strategies against FGM. But again, there are questions of cultural competence in delivering these strategies, questions of understanding of cultural sensitivities, of cultural specificities in the practice, unintended consequences of profiling and harassment communities have complained about, and the question of community involvement. The strategies do call for community involvement in their design, but communities have also complained that they are involved in a tokenistic way. Next slide, please. So the aims of this research was to build understanding of the issue of FGMC in Scotland, and also to co-create with stakeholders recommendations for how the situation could be improved. And I did this using a systems approach to the matter. Next slide, please. So the stakeholders involved. So I was looking at the big picture. We're looking at all the groups which addressed FGMC. So starting with the third sector, community groups and NGOs, and the statutory sector involved in the health services, social services, education, police, and the children's reporter. Next slide, please. And the study went through initial individual interviews, and then a first set of workshops, and then a second set of workshops to find ways to improve the situation. Next slide, please. So you will not be able to see the tiny details on this slide. A high definition, high resolution map is available at the QR code. But this rich picture tried to capture the broad picture of what's going on with the affected communities in the center and the services addressing the issue laid out roundabout. Next slide, please. So if we go through the center of the picture, looking at the situation in affected communities, the center is supposed to indicate that it's a community practice, not an individual practice. The practice is driven by the community. It's not thought of by individuals, Attitudes to the practice are divided. It's not a monolithic view in affected communities. Some people are very much opposed to the practice, whereas others feel it's fine. Where it is practiced, it's a social expectation. There's community pressure to do it because it's seen as the culture. It is the culture. And if you do not do it, then you may be seen as an irresponsible parent. Where it is practiced, in communities where it's practiced, it may give status as an adult. In other communities, it is related to marriage. Or questions of whether it is a religious requirement or whether it prevents promiscuity drive the practice. And often it is the context where women are seen as less than men in social standing. It is often not talked about casually, so you'd have to have reason to raise it, but certainly it's not a topic for public discussion. In some cases, it may be a taboo topic. A lot of women are not aware of its harmfulness. Even women who have gone through the most severe forms of FGMC may not actually immediately connect the dots between their experiences. They may go through a light bulb moment when these things are tabled before them, and then they connect the dots and realize that the problems they are experiencing are due to the cut that they had. And when people do realize it is harmful, questions of whether to medicalize it to reduce the harm come up. Now, views change over time, over exposure to different information, living in a diasporic community. But all of that takes place in the context of other priorities. So immigration, housing, jobs, money, all the things people think about. And further, the wider context of stigma. So if you're against the practice, you may be stigmatized by your community of origin. On the other hand, in Scotland, you may be stigmatized just for being from an affected community. So that was trying to capture the situation as it is in affected communities. Next slide, please. And laid out around it here are the various services. Now, in the circles, I have put the priorities for the different groups. And in the rectangles, there are challenges, and they vary. So, for example, the community groups are focused on education and awareness raising, but they do have challenges, well, funding and limited time, profiling. Also, they find that some activists may be culturally distanced from the communities and carry out their activism in a culturally insensitive way. For NGOs, their concern was women not being self-aware about FGM, also a hesitancy to report for fear of criminalizing family members. The health services were concerned about women not reporting problems which women might feel are completely normal for a woman to have, and were concerned about training for their staff. For the education, the social workers, the police, and the children's reporter, broadly, the problem they highlighted was a lack of understanding and awareness in the service of the issues. Next slide, please. So across these various sectors in which FGM is addressed and in these various ways, broadly, these 10 ways, these 10 approaches emerged. And this is it. It was to make services accessible, challenge drivers, improve collaboration, build understanding, protect children, and so on. But it varied across the different groups who were addressing the FGMC. So next slide, please. The community groups had the widest range of ways in which they addressed the practice. So some groups focused on challenging drivers because they felt if people are aware and educated on the fact that these things are not necessary, not required, they would change their attitude, change their practice. Another community group focused on engaging men because they felt that had men been involved in this fight from the get-go, the practice would now be in its dying days. Another group focused on supporting good policy because they pointed out that if the policy is poorly informed or poorly delivered, it might undermine the efforts to end FGMC. Next slide, please. For the statutory services, the way that they addressed it was much more linked to the role. So the health people wanted to deliver their service. The police wanted to facilitate reporting. Social services wanted to protect children. Now, everybody wanted to protect children, but this was a particular priority for the social services. Next slide, please. And there are some ways which were practiced across the board. So people wanted to make their service accessible, to support women, to build understanding, and everybody wanted to improve collaboration. Next slide, please. Now, in all these different ways of addressing FGM, there were challenges. Again, you cannot see the details on this map. High-resolution map is at the QR code, but the purpose of the map was to show that the various challenges experienced by individuals, by communities, by services were all interlinked, ultimately. And the usefulness of this map to any stakeholders involved would be to create a better situational awareness. You know that the challenge of particular interest to you, you then can easily see what is upstream of that leading to this challenge you have, and then downstream. Next slide, please. So, ways to improve the situation. At the top of the table here, what I mean by strong consensus is that these were priorities for all stakeholders involved. Okay. At the bottom of the table, when I say low consensus, it doesn't mean that these were priorities which were not as important, simply that they were prioritized by fewer stakeholders. So everybody was agreed on the need for a standardized framework for FGMC for all services, for training and engagement. This to be actually born out of a sound collaborative approach and greater collaboration between all services. Next slide, please. So this is a useful way to look at the situation. FGMC exists on 3 levels: the conceptual, social, and individual. The conceptual in the beliefs that drive the practice, that this thing is good, that it is useful, that it is necessary, and that it is not harmful. At the social level, it exists in the social structures, which then drive the practice. So the requirements for FGM for adult status, or the requirement for it prior to marriage or for marriage. And at the individual level, it exists in the experienced mental and physical effects. Now, FGMC is also addressed at these 3 levels. So the community groups primarily address it at the conceptual level, challenging the beliefs, challenging the drivers, educating people. At the social level, we have got the law and the intervention of social work, attempting to prevent a practice where it is to be done or suspected to be done. And at the individual level, the health services address the mental and the physical effects of FGMC to the extent possible. In terms of strategies to address FGMC, a sound, comprehensive strategy needs to reflect every aspect of shown in this circle. If there is not a sound collaboration, then you might find that what happens is that the services are trying to address a practice they do not fully understand in communities they do not quite have access to, which will be quite difficult. Okay, next slide, please. So, recommendations for greater collaboration between all stakeholders, standardized tool to be used, capacity building for communities to better collaborate, a cohesive approach to the issue, prior findings to be implemented. So prior consultations have been done with communities, and they don't always see the outcomes. And I would like to pause on the last 2, training materials with appropriate imagery and language, and a sensitive training approach for agencies. Interestingly, the issue of training materials was a problem, as it were, on both ends of the spectrum, because communities complained that graphic imagery makes a spectacle of women. Insensitive language is not helpful. On the other end, some of the statutory services also complained that graphic materials are not, well, they may be a call to action, but they do not actually empower people to address the practice effectively. In fact, they may put people off training. Language, the guidance language, they pointed out that it is quite clinical sometimes, and they are not clinicians, they are lay people discussing a sensitive topic with lay people. And some of the guidance documents they had did not give them that human picture and human context which they needed. Okay, so this sensitive approach for training approach for agencies is also important, because if people do not engage with training on the issue, they will be unprepared. They might be the person that is landed with a case which they have to address. So I think that's it. Next slide. Thank you very much.